How does a three-star general, a mother who's led troops across oceans, end up staring down the barrel of a gun at her own son's funeral? In this gripping, true-to-life story, General Naomi Caldwell faces a shocking betrayal on the most sacred day of her life. Watch the full story, subscribe for more powerful moments, hit like, and share this video, so no one forgets what happened that morning. The morning at Arlington National Cemetery felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The sky hung low and gray, not with the threat of rain, but with the weight of grief, as if the heavens understood what was about to unfold. General Naomi Caldwell stepped from the black SUV with the kind of composure that only decades of military service could forge. She had worn this uniform through battlefields half a world away, under blistering desert suns and in the dust-choked aftermath of explosions. She had addressed foreign dignitaries, stood at the head of global summits, and commanded men and women through the kind of missions that never made the news. But on this day, her most decorated day, there was no briefing, no objective, no enemy to outthink, only a flag-draped casket that held her only child. Captain Daniel Caldwell had been 29 years old. An improvised explosive device on a routine patrol in southern Afghanistan had ripped him away from her, from the country he swore to protect, from the future he had been building one letter home at a time. Naomi had buried soldiers before. Too many. She had stood at the edges of open graves with her hands locked in the stillness of a salute as taps played and another family's world caved in. She knew the rhythm of a military funeral, the precise way the flag was folded, the exact angle of the bugler's horn, the way the air seemed to thin as the final salute was given. But this was unlike anything she had ever known. This time, the folded flag would be pressed into her hands. This time, the name etched in stone would carry her own bloodline. She had spent 35 years preparing for every imaginable contingency in combat, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of walking toward her son's grave. She had chosen to wear her full dress uniform because Daniel had once asked her to. Years earlier, before deployment, he had joked with her over dinner, "When my time comes, Mom, I want you in all your stars. I want them to see exactly who raised me." She had laughed at him then, swatting the conversation away, unwilling to imagine that kind of loss. But now, here she was, every detail perfect. Deep blue jacket pressed so sharply it could cut, gold braid gleaming against her sleeve, and the 3 silver stars on her shoulders, catching what little light the sun allowed through the clouds. The medals on her chest told the story of a career built on discipline, courage, and sacrifice. The Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Bronze Star, the Meritorious Service Medal, and more than a dozen others, each one a chapter in her life. To the outside world, she was an unshakable fortress in full regalia. Inside, she was a shattered mother struggling to keep her footing. The ride to Section 60, the part of Arlington reserved for those lost in the most recent wars, was short but endless. Naomi sat between her younger brother, Anthony Caldwell, and Colonel Denise Harper, Daniel's godmother and her closest friend from years in the service. Anthony's hand rested lightly over hers, a silent reminder that she was not alone, though no comfort could reach the place in her heart that ached most. Denise sat ramrod straight, her own uniform immaculate, her jaw tight. They had been in war zones together, and Denise knew the look Naomi wore now. It was the same one she had seen on soldiers who walked away from a blast, physically untouched but changed forever. Naomi's gaze fell to the funeral program in her lap. On the cover, Daniel was grinning in his fatigues, a boyish mischief still alive in his eyes. She remembered the moment that photograph was taken, how he had teased her for being too serious, how he'd flashed that smile right after saying, "Come on, Mom, you're supposed to look proud." She had. She still did. Even now, in the shadow of grief, pride was threaded through her sorrow like a steel cable. Her son had served with honor. He had died in uniform. And today, she would honor him in the same way. When the SUV rolled to a slow stop, Naomi drew in a deep breath, steadying herself. Her heels touched the pavement with a muted click as she stepped out. The weight of her uniform suddenly more than fabric and metal. It felt like the weight of her entire life pressing down on her shoulders. The honor guard stood ready in perfect formation, their rifles gleaming, their faces solemn. A few soldiers nearby recognized her immediately, snapping crisp salutes that she returned with mechanical precision. But today, she was not their commanding officer. Today, she was just Daniel's mother. Anthony moved to her side, offering a hand she didn't take. Her posture remained rigid, her stride deliberate. The casket was waiting, the American flag stretched taut across its surface, the stars and stripes vivid against the somber background of stone and grass. She focused on that image as if it could anchor her in place. Every step toward it felt heavier, as though the ground itself resisted letting her move closer to the moment she had been dreading since the day Daniel left for his final tour. There was a quiet murmur among the gathered mourners, a mix of military personnel, childhood friends of Daniel's, neighbors, and family who had traveled from across the country. Some stood at attention, others with heads bowed, hands clasped. Naomi caught sight of one of Daniel's platoon mates, a young man barely out of his 20s, his face pale and eyes fixed on the casket. She knew that look, too. It was the look of someone who had survived what another had not. Naomi's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the cuff of her jacket. The cool air bit at her skin, but she welcomed it. It kept her anchored in the moment, prevented her from slipping into the numbness that had threatened to take hold since she'd received the knock at her door. The memory of that morning was still raw. The uniformed officers, the words that seemed to come from underwater, the way the world had tilted when she realized she would never again hear Daniel's voice. She took her place at the head of the casket, the place reserved for the next of kin. It felt both wrong and inevitable to be standing there. Denise stood a few feet away, her eyes wet but her chin high. Anthony was a steady presence at her flank. The chaplain stepped forward, offering words meant to comfort, but Naomi barely heard them. Her focus was on the flag, on the way the wind caught its edge and made it ripple, on the way it seemed to breathe with the morning air. She thought of Daniel as a boy, racing across their backyard with a makeshift cape, telling her he was going to be a hero one day. She thought of the man he became and the promise he had kept. The scene was almost unbearable in its perfection. The symmetry of the honor guard, the gleam of the rifles, the hush of the crowd, the quiet dignity of the grounds. Naomi had led soldiers into hostile territory, navigated the political minefields of military command, and stared down enemies across negotiating tables. Yet, standing here, in the quiet heart of Arlington, she felt the most fragile she had ever been. And still, she stood tall. Because that was what Daniel had asked of her. That was what the uniform demanded. She drew in another breath, preparing herself for the long, solemn sequence of the funeral. She believed she knew the pain that awaited her, believed she understood the shape of this day. But what Naomi Caldwell could not yet know was that before her son was laid to rest, a moment was coming that would turn this day into something else entirely. A moment that would strip away the sanctity of her grief and ignite a storm that would spread far beyond these quiet rows of white stone. The gray morning did not lift, not even slightly. as the minutes bled into one another. It was the kind of sky that pressed down like a physical weight, muting colors, swallowing light, making the white marble headstones of Arlington appear almost spectral. Naomi Caldwell felt every ounce of that heaviness in her chest, as if the atmosphere itself conspired to mirror the burden she carried. Standing between her younger brother Anthony and Colonel Denise Harper, she could almost pretend for a moment that she was surrounded by the kind of security detail she'd known in foreign cities, a protective flanking formation. But this was not protection. This was family. The only people who could be close enough to feel the full force of what she was holding in. Anthony, 6 years her junior, stood solidly at her right. He had her same square jaw and measured eyes, though today his gaze was fixed on the ground in front of him, as if afraid that if he looked up and met her eyes, he might shatter. His hand brushed hers once, a silent reassurance, but Naomi barely moved in acknowledgement. She couldn't. The discipline that had carried her through 3 decades of service demanded she keep her posture unbroken. On her left, Denise Harper stood as she had so many times before, in uniform, precise, unyielding, a woman carved from the same steel Naomi had forged herself in. Denise had been Daniel's godmother since the day he was born. She was the first person Naomi had called after receiving her commission as a general. And she had been the one who stayed with Naomi's mother during the long deployments when Daniel was still a child. Now, her expression was unreadable, her eyes forward, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. But Naomi didn't need to see tears to know they were there, just beneath the surface. She could feel Denise's grief the way a soldier can feel the presence of another in a darkened room. It radiated, quiet, but undeniable. Ahead of them, the honor guard stood at immaculate attention, a living embodiment of military precision. 6 soldiers in dress uniform, their shoes like polished obsidian, their rifles gleaming in the dull light. Every movement was rehearsed, every breath measured. Naomi had inspected honor guards before, had drilled young soldiers on how to fold a flag without a single wrinkle, how to march in unison so precise that their boots struck the pavement like a single heartbeat. But this morning, she wasn't their superior officer. She was the reason they were here. She was the mother they would honor. And that shift in role felt disorienting, like walking into a familiar room that had been rearranged in the dark. The crowd was larger than Naomi expected. She had anticipated Daniel's unit, a handful of family, and a scattering of friends from his childhood in Virginia. But there were faces she didn't recognize, fellow officers from across the branches, Gold Star families she had met only briefly at military galas, neighbors from their quiet cul-de-sac. A ripple of solemn acknowledgement moved through them when she stepped into view. Some straightened to attention, others lowered their heads in quiet respect. Naomi could feel the collective focus, the unspoken agreement to hold this space sacred for as long as it took.
A lone bugler stood off to the side, horn tucked under one arm, waiting for the moment when the opening notes of taps would thread through the air. Naomi had heard that sound more times than she could count, but she knew that today it would land differently. It wouldn't just be the closing of a chapter. It would be the tearing out of a page she could never get back. Anthony shifted slightly beside her, leaning in just enough to speak under his breath. "You ready?" It was a pointless question, and they both knew it. Ready wasn't a state she could reach. This was something to endure, not something to prepare for. She gave the smallest nod, her eyes fixed on the casket still resting inside the hearse. The chaplain's voice rose, low and steady, calling the gathering to order. The murmurs in the crowd faded into a silence so deep Naomi could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the distance. Somewhere, a child sniffled, the sound quickly muffled by an adult's comforting hand. Naomi's gaze swept the crowd without moving her head. She caught the eyes of Sergeant Paul Rivers, a young soldier from Daniel's unit. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, his eyes locked on the ground in front of him. She recognized that look instantly. It was the same expression she had worn countless times, standing at other gravesides, holding herself still while the world seemed to crumble around her. She inhaled deeply, drawing the air in until it filled her lungs to the point of ache. The scent of cut grass and distant rain lingered in the air. It reminded her faintly of Daniel's last summer home before deployment, when he had mowed the lawn in the early evening light, music blaring from his phone, his shirt sticking to his back in the heat. He had been laughing that night, teasing her about her exacting standards for a straight lawn pattern. The memory cut cleanly through her composure, but she didn't let it show. Not here. Not now. Colonel Harper leaned forward slightly, her voice just above a whisper. He'd be proud of you. Naomi's eyes stayed fixed ahead, but her hand twitched once at her side. It was the only sign she had heard. The movement began with the soft clink of metal against metal as the honor guard stepped forward, the synchronized rise and fall of their boots sharp in the heavy air. They took their positions at the rear of the hearse, their gloved hands reaching for the casket. Naomi's throat tightened as she watched the flag ripple faintly, its edges catching the slightest whisper of wind. The casket emerged slowly, with a weight far heavier than its physical mass. She had carried injured soldiers on stretchers before, had helped lift the bodies of those who didn't survive, but watching strangers carry her son, watching him leave the safety of the vehicle for the cold permanence of the earth, was a pain she hadn't been able to imagine until this moment. As the honor guard began the slow, deliberate march toward the burial site, Naomi's steps matched theirs. Anthony and Denise fell into place beside her, the three of them forming a small, unbreakable line behind Daniel's final journey. The crowd shifted, heads turning, bodies leaning ever so slightly forward to catch sight of the procession. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the steady rhythm of boots and the faint hum of the distant highway. When they reached the graveside, the honor guard positioned the casket with mechanical grace, lowering it onto the supports above the open earth. Naomi took her place at the head, directly opposite the chaplain. Anthony and Denise stood close enough that she could feel their presence in her peripheral vision. The chaplain began to speak, his words about honor and sacrifice falling into the air like stones into water, sending ripples through the gathered mourners. Naomi heard them distantly, as though they were meant for someone else. Her attention was locked on the flag, on the careful precision with which the honor guard folded one corner over the other, each movement crisp and deliberate. She thought of Daniel's hands, strong, calloused, capable, and how they would never again pull her into a bear hug that lifted her off her feet. A single crow called from somewhere beyond the headstones, its voice rough and jarring against the soft cadence of the service. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly, the sound pulling her into the present. This was the moment she had braced for, the heart of the day's sorrow. Yet, even as the service continued, there was a subtle shift in the air, something she couldn't quite name. It was as if a faint current of unease had threaded itself into the ceremony, invisible but real. She didn't know it yet, but that undercurrent was the first sign that this day would not remain contained within the boundaries of grief alone. Something was coming, and when it arrived, it would tear through this solemn silence like a gunshot.
The chaplain's words were still rolling gently through the air when Naomi caught the first flicker of movement in her peripheral vision. It wasn't from the honor guard or the mourners. This was sharper, more agitated, like a discordant note in a piece of music meant to be solemn. Off to the far side of the row of white headstones, just beyond the line of parked vehicles, a lone figure in a navy blue police uniform was pacing beside his cruiser. His patrol car sat at an awkward angle across the narrow road. Engine still running, lights dark. He wore mirrored sunglasses despite the thick gray cloud cover, and his head moved in quick, restless motions, scanning the area as if searching for something. Or someone. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. She had been trained to notice threats long before they revealed themselves, and something about his stance prickled against the back of her neck. This was Officer Ryan Mercer, though Naomi didn't know his name yet. His presence here wasn't entirely out of place. Local police were often assigned to assist with traffic during high-profile military funerals. But the energy radiating off him was wrong. Too tense, too suspicious. He wasn't watching the flow of vehicles or the crowd. He was watching people, scanning faces like he was looking for a suspect. Naomi shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, her spine aligning into a posture she knew from combat zones. Alert, prepared. As the chaplain spoke on about sacrifice and honor, Naomi kept him in her periphery. She told herself it was nothing, just a man doing his job, but the knot forming in her stomach said otherwise. She had learned long ago to trust that knot. In Afghanistan, ignoring it could cost lives. Here, at Arlington, it seemed absurd to think it would matter. But instincts didn't care about location. They just whispered the same warning over and is off. Something is off. She looked away, back toward the casket, willing her focus to remain where it belonged. But when she glanced back again, Mercer was moving toward her. His steps were quick, direct, almost confrontational. His right hand hovered just above his hip, brushing against the butt of his sidearm with a familiarity that was less about comfort and more about readiness. Naomi straightened without thinking, her head tilting slightly, her eyes locking on him with the same unflinching steadiness she had given to generals, dignitaries, and foreign negotiators alike. He stopped a few feet away, his voice cutting across the hush of the graveside service. "Ma'am, I need to see some ID." For a moment, Naomi thought she had misheard him. The words didn't fit the place, the occasion, or the reality in front of him. She was in full dress uniform, 3 silver stars gleaming on her shoulders, medals perfectly aligned across her chest. She had just walked behind a flag-draped casket in a formation flanked by the honor guard. And yet, here was this officer, voice sharp and insistent, asking her for identification like she was an intruder. Naomi didn't answer immediately. Her first instinct was disbelief. Her second was calculation. Around them, she felt the ripple of attention from the mourners, heads turning, whispers starting. Anthony shifted closer, his posture tightening. Denise's jaw hardened, her eyes fixed on Mercer like she could will him to step back. "I'm General Naomi Caldwell," she said finally, her tone even, the authority in her voice clear and deliberate. "I'm here for my son's funeral." But Mercer didn't blink. He didn't even glance at the casket or the honor guard. His hand slid fully onto the grip of his pistol now, his fingers flexing against the molded holster. "I said stop right there!" he barked, his voice rising enough to draw more eyes from the crowd. Naomi froze, more out of training than fear. The last thing she wanted was to escalate a situation in a place where the slightest misstep could fracture the sanctity of the day. She was used to hostile stares in foreign lands, but there was something uniquely jarring about seeing one here, on American soil, in the middle of sacred ground. She took a slow, measured breath. "Officer, I am unarmed. This is my dress uniform. You are making a mistake." But Mercer's expression didn't shift. The mirrored lenses of his sunglasses turned her own reflection back at her, stoic, still, framed by the white headstones behind her. "I don't care what kind of costume you're wearing," he snapped, his voice edged with contempt. "Get on the ground before I put you there." A gasp rolled through the mourners like a physical wave. Somewhere behind her, Naomi heard Denise's breath catch. Anthony took a half step forward, his voice low but dangerous. "Back off," he said to Mercer. But the officer's head jerked in his direction, and the barrel of the pistol followed. The honor guard tensed, their discipline holding them in place even as the unspoken urge to intervene rippled through them. Naomi caught one soldier's eyes, a young man standing at the edge of the formation, his jaw set. But a barely perceptible shake of her head held him in place. The last thing she wanted was for this to spiral into violence in front of Daniel's casket. Her hands rose slowly, palms outward, a gesture of control as much as surrender. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice dropping into the calm, commanding register she had used in combat. "This is a funeral. My son's funeral." The tension in the air had shifted now, becoming something electric and volatile. Parents pulled children closer. Phones appeared in the hands of more than one mourner, their cameras already capturing the surreal tableau. A decorated general, hands raised, facing down a drawn weapon at her own child's burial. Mercer's voice cut through again, sharp as broken glass. "Turn around, on your knees, hands on your head." Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears, but her face remained impassive. 35 years of service had taught her how to manage fear, how to fold it into focus. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, hearing Daniel's voice in her memory. "Stand tall, Mom. No matter what." When she opened them, her gaze was steady. She began to lower herself, not because she was afraid for herself, but because she could feel the fragile threads holding the crowd's panic in check. She would not let Daniel's funeral become the scene of a bloodbath. Somewhere in the crowd, a voice rang out, hoarse and furious. "What in God's name is wrong with you? That's General Caldwell." Mercer didn't flinch. If anything, his grip on the weapon seemed to tighten. Naomi could feel Anthony trembling with barely contained rage beside her. Denise shifted just enough to be ready if things turned worse. The air was so taut, it felt like the slightest movement would snap it. In the distance, movement caught Naomi's attention. Fast, purposeful. A woman in a traffic vest was sprinting toward them from the main gate, her voice cutting through the standoff like a whip crack. "Mercer! Holster your weapon now!" But Mercer didn't move. Naomi didn't know it yet. But this was Lieutenant Carla Morales, and she was about to alter the trajectory of this day forever. For a long, taut second after Naomi's quiet declaration, "I'm General Naomi Caldwell. I'm here for my son's funeral," there was no sound except the slow, ceremonial rustle of the honor guard's uniforms in the breeze. It should have been enough. Her rank, her presence beside the casket, the 3 silver stars gleaming against the deep blue of her dress jacket. Every piece of it screamed truth. But in Officer Ryan Mercer's eyes, hidden behind those mirror-polished lenses, there was nothing but suspicion. His head tilted slightly, the way a predator sizes up prey. Then his mouth twisted into a humorless smirk. "Yeah, right," he said, the words dripping with contempt. "You're not fooling me. You're posing." The accusation landed like a slap. A ripple of disbelief passed through the crowd. Someone audibly gasped. Naomi's pulse thudded against her ribs, not with fear, at least not yet, but with a growing, cold anger. Posing. As if 35 years of service, as if the scars earned on 3 continents, as if the countless soldiers she had led and buried were nothing more than theater to him. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Her voice remained low even, but edged with steel. "Officer, this is my dress uniform. My son is in that casket. Stand down." But Mercer didn't stand down. In fact, the muscles in his arm flexed as his hand shifted, unfastening the snap of his holster with a practiced flick. The small, sharp click of the release carried farther than it should have in the open air. A sound Naomi had heard in combat zones, but never expected to hear here, in the hallowed stillness of Arlington. Then the weapon was out. A Glock, black and dull against the gray sky, barrel rising until it pointed directly at the center of her chest. The sight of it cracked the fragile solemnity of the funeral wide open. A murmur ran through the gathered mourners, not loud but urgent, like the buzz before a storm breaks. Somewhere to her left, Naomi heard Denise's sharp intake of breath, heard Anthony's low curse under his breath. The honor guard froze, not from fear, but from the discipline drilled into them, that reflexive calculation of when to act and when to hold. The soldiers' eyes flicked to their commanding officer in silent question, but Naomi gave no signal. Her hands rose slowly, palms outward, the universal gesture of, "I am not a threat." Her movements were deliberate, her posture still regal, her eyes locked on Mercer's face. "I am unarmed," she said, her tone calm, unwavering. "This is my son's funeral. You are making a mistake you cannot undo." But the weapon didn't lower. If anything, Mercer's grip seemed to tighten, his finger curling just a fraction closer to the trigger. "I don't care what story you're selling," he barked. "You're in a costume, and you're acting suspicious. Get on the ground before I put you there." The words sliced through the air like a blade. Naomi had faced down enemy fire, had heard insurgents scream orders in languages she barely understood, had felt the deadly weight of being the only one standing between her people and death. But she had never been told to get on the ground with a gun aimed at her by someone wearing the same flag on his shoulder that she had sworn to defend. Behind her, a veteran in a wheelchair shouted, his voice hoarse with outrage. "That's General Caldwell! What the hell is wrong with you?" Mercer didn't so much as flick his eyes toward the voice. His focus was locked on her, tunnel vision narrowing until there was nothing else in his world but the target in front of him. Anthony stepped forward, his voice taut with fury. "She told you who she is! Put the damn gun down!" The pistol swung toward Anthony in a flash, the movement so quick, Naomi's gut tightened. She'd seen this moment before, in dusty alleyways overseas, in the seconds before chaos erupted. "Back off," Mercer snapped at him, "or you're next." Denise's hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her jaw locked so tight Naomi could hear the faint grind of teeth. The honor guard shifted their weight almost imperceptibly, the kind of micro-movement that said they were seconds away from breaking protocol if they had to. Naomi's heart was hammering now, but her training held her steady. She kept her voice level, projecting the command she'd used to cut through battlefield panic. "Listen to me, officer. There are children here, families. Lower your weapon." But Mercer only shook his head once, short and sharp, his sunglasses reflecting her back at herself. A mother in full uniform, hands raised, in the shadow of her son's coffin. Phones were everywhere now. She could see them out of the corner of her eye. Small black rectangles lifted above heads, red recording lights blinking. It didn't matter. In Mercer's mind, this wasn't a funeral. It was a threat scenario, and he had already decided who the enemy was. "You're going to turn around," he ordered, voice low and deadly now, "and you're going to get on your knees, hands on your head." Naomi inhaled, slow and deliberate. She'd survived firefights, ambushes, mortar attacks. She'd buried friends and soldiers she'd sworn to bring home alive. But this was a new kind of battlefield. A sacred place, desecrated by the muzzle of a gun. Her eyes dropped once, just once, to the casket, the flag still perfectly stretched across its surface. Not here, not today, she thought. Whatever happened next, she would not let Daniel's funeral become a crossfire. She began to lower herself, her knees bending inch by inch, the gravel beneath her heels crunching softly. She could feel every gaze on her, the shock, the outrage, the disbelief that this could be happening here, to her. in this place. From somewhere in the crowd, another voice rang out, sharp and furious. "Somebody stop that maniac!" Naomi lifted one hand slightly, palm toward the crowd in a subtle gesture. Don't. She knew too well how quickly fear could ignite into violence, and she would not be the match. Then, movement. Fast. Urgent. Lieutenant Carla Morales, the officer Naomi had glimpsed in the distance, was suddenly there, sprinting the last few yards, her voice cutting through the tension like a whip crack. "Mercer! Holster your weapon now!" He didn't move. "I said holster it!" Morales shouted again, her tone climbing to the command pitch that left no room for negotiation. "That is a 3-star general." Still, the gun stayed fixed on Naomi, and in that instant, Morales didn't hesitate. She surged forward, both hands snapping to Mercer's arm, slamming it sideways with enough force to jar the weapon from his grip. The Glock clattered against the asphalt, a hollow metallic sound that seemed impossibly loud against the quiet of the cemetery. Mercer staggered, his hand already reaching for the fallen weapon, but Morales was faster, twisting his arm into a control hold that brought him off balance in an instant. "You're done," she hissed, her teeth clenched. "You are done." Other officers, drawn by the commotion, rushed in, grabbing Mercer by the shoulders and dragging him back as he twisted and spat protests. Naomi stayed on her knees for a moment longer, her hands still raised, her body locked in the muscle memory of survival. Only when Sergeant Paul Rivers, one of Daniel's own men, knelt beside her and said quietly, "Ma'am, it's over," did she allow herself to stand. Her legs felt like stone. Her chest ached. Around her, the mourners were frozen in a stunned silence, their eyes wide, their phones still raised. And there, at the center of it all, was the casket, Daniel's casket, waiting for the ceremony that had been ripped apart by a gun in the hands of one of their own. For a heartbeat after Lieutenant Morales slammed Mercer's pistol to the ground, the cemetery seemed to hang in a stunned, unnatural stillness. The echoes of metal striking asphalt still clung to the air, sharp and metallic, like the final clang of a dropped shell casing. Naomi remained on her knees, her hands still raised as though the weapon were still leveled at her, her body locked in the reflex of decades spent surviving situations where hesitation could mean death. Anthony was the first to break the paralysis around her. He moved from her right side in 2 quick steps, his hand half raised in the air, not in surrender, but in a defensive gesture meant to draw Mercer's attention away from his sister. "She told you who she is?" he barked, his voice ringing across the burial site, heavy with anger. "She's my sister, General Naomi Caldwell. Put the damn gun down." But Mercer, wild-eyed and breathing hard, snapped his head toward Anthony so fast it was like a predator catching fresh movement in the corner of its vision. The pistol, still warm from his grip, lay only a few feet away on the pavement, but his body language was every bit as threatening without it. His hand twitched toward the weapon on the ground before shifting abruptly toward his duty belt, like a man unwilling to admit the fight was already lost. That quick, lethal turn of focus sent Naomi's pulse slamming against her ribs. She had seen it in war zones, a sudden redirection of threat, the split-second moment when all eyes and all guns could swing to a new target. And here, in the sacred hush of Arlington, that target was now her brother. "Back off, sir," Mercer snarled, his voice raw. His stance shifted into something more aggressive, his weight on the balls of his feet, as though daring Anthony to take one step closer. Anthony's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, Colonel Denise Harper's voice cut through the tension like the crack of a whip. "Stand down!" It wasn't aimed at Mercer. It was aimed at the honor guard. The 6 soldiers in dress blues had already begun to shift, not dramatically, not enough for most civilians to notice, but Naomi caught it instantly. The subtle widening of their stances, the micro-adjustments of their grip on ceremonial rifles, the taut readiness in their shoulders. They weren't just honor guards anymore. They were soldiers, and the instinct to protect a commanding officer, especially one of Naomi's stature, ran bone deep. Denise stepped half a pace forward, angling herself toward them, her chin dipping in a deliberate, almost imperceptible signal. Hold. The young sergeant at the front of the line, barely 24 by the look of him, froze mid-shift, his gaze locked on Denise's. His jaw clenched, but he gave a tiny nod, pulling himself back into the rigid stillness of formation. The others followed suit, but Naomi could see the current of barely contained energy still running through them. If Denise hadn't intervened, the situation could have ignited in less than a second. Honor Guard soldiers closing ranks on a local cop. Mercer reacting, Morales caught in the middle. A single misread move, and Daniel's funeral would have become a flashpoint for bloodshed. But holding the soldiers in check didn't stop the other eyes watching. In the crowd of mourners, phones had bloomed like black, rectangular flowers in trembling hands. Naomi caught the faint glint of sunlight off a lens, the red glow of recording lights blinking in unison. It wasn't just one or two people, half a dozen, maybe more, had their devices raised, arms extended, capturing the unthinkable. A decorated general, kneeling at her son's grave, hands raised, a police officer lunging for his weapon. Soldiers tensed in formation, restrained only by an unspoken code. Some recorded openly, their faces set in grim determination. Others tried to be discreet, holding their phones low, angled upward, eyes flicking between their screens and the unfolding scene. Naomi knew instantly that whatever happened here, this moment would not vanish quietly into rumor and official reports. It was being documented, immortalized in shaky, pixelated frames that could travel farther and faster than any of them could imagine. From somewhere in the back, a woman's voice called out, low but urgent. "Get this on video! Don't stop filming!" Another man, a veteran judging by the cap on his head, muttered loud enough to carry, "They're gonna try to spin this. Make sure they can't." Naomi's eyes closed for the briefest moment, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of it all. She hadn't come here to make a statement. She hadn't come here to be a symbol or a headline. She had come here for one reason, to lay her son to rest with the dignity and honor he had earned. And now, with dozens of lenses trained on her, that moment was being stripped bare in real time. She opened her eyes again and saw Anthony still squared off with Mercer, his shoulders rigid, his chest heaving. Morales had her grip locked on Mercer's wrist now, but she hadn't yet forced him to the ground. It was a stalemate, a dangerous one. The wrong word, the wrong twitch of a hand, and it could tilt into chaos. Denise's eyes flicked to Naomi, the briefest, sharpest look. A question. "Do you want me to end this?" Naomi gave a small, deliberate shake of her head. Her voice, when it came, was steady enough to be heard by the nearest rows of mourners. "No one moves," she said, more command than request. Anthony glanced at her, his brow furrowed, but something in her tone rooted him to the spot. Around them, the murmurs had grown into a low hum of outrage. A young woman in civilian clothes, a soldier's widow Naomi vaguely recognized, was already speaking into her phone, live streaming to an audience somewhere out in the digital ether. "Look at this," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "Look at what's happening. She's a general, a mother, at her own son's funeral, and they're treating her like a criminal." Naomi could feel the crowd's mood shifting from shock into something hotter, sharper. The tension wasn't just in the air. It was alive now, feeding on itself. Every second Mercer refused to back down was another second the witness's disbelief hardened into anger. From the edge of the crowd, a child's voice piped up, high and frightened. "Mommy, why's he yelling at her?" The question hung there, piercing in its innocence, before being swallowed by the murmured curses of adults too furious to answer gently. Morales made her move then. With one swift motion, she wrenched Mercer's arm back and down, forcing his shoulder toward the ground. The suddenness of it startled even the closest mourners, a sharp gasp rising from the crowd. Mercer's knees buckled, and the fight went out of him in an angry grunt as Morales kicked his weapon further away across the pavement. Two other officers rushed in, grabbing Mercer by the arms, pulling him back toward the patrol car. His voice rose in protest, indignant, almost rehearsed. "She didn't belong here! She wasn't acting right!" The words drew a sharp exhale from Naomi, the closest thing she'd allowed herself to a visible reaction since the ordeal began. Not acting right. It was the language she had heard in every debrief about every wrongful stop, every unnecessary escalation. Language meant to strip the target of legitimacy. Anthony turned toward her, his voice low. "You okay?" Naomi didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted over the crowd, the phones still held aloft, the faces tense with a mix of horror and purpose. She saw the honor guard still frozen in their exact positions, Denise's hand still at her side like a coiled spring. And beyond them all, she saw the casket. Daniel's casket. Untouched, but now surrounded by an entirely different kind of battlefield. Finally, she nodded once. "Let's finish this," she said quietly. And though the words were meant for the funeral, Naomi already knew that finishing this, what had just happened, what had been witnessed, would take far longer than a folded flag and a final salute. From her post near the main gate, Lieutenant Carla Morales had been directing a slow trickle of vehicles toward the outer parking loop when the first ripple of unease reached her. It wasn't a sound so much as a shift in the air, the kind of low, collective murmur she'd learned to recognize after years of working crowd details. She looked up, scanning the line of white headstones and the mourners gathered in a tight half-circle. That's when she saw it. Officer Ryan Mercer, a man she barely knew but had worked alongside on traffic shifts, standing stiff and aggressive with his sidearm leveled at, her breath caught, at a woman in full military dress blues. Even from nearly 50 yards away, the 3 silver stars on the woman's shoulder boards caught Morales's eye. She didn't have to know the general's name to know she was looking at a very high-ranking officer, and that Mercer was about 2 seconds away from making a career-ending, life-ending mistake. "Mercer!" she shouted as she broke into a sprint, her boots pounding the narrow asphalt path cut through Section 60. The rows of headstones blurred past in her peripheral vision, the sound of the service unraveling into scattered gasps and raised voices. "Holster your weapon now! Weapon now!" The distance closed fast, her breathing sharp and even despite the surge of adrenaline. Mercer didn't turn toward her. His focus was locked on the woman, who stood with her hands raised, back straight, eyes steady, a posture that read equal parts surrender and defiance. "Holster it now!" Morales barked again, her voice cutting through the heavy air like a command on a firing range. She was close enough now to see Mercer's jaw working, his sunglasses reflecting the woman in front of him and the crowd just beyond. Close enough to see that his finger was inside the trigger guard. And still, he didn't move. Her training told her that every second mattered now, that the longer a drawn weapon stayed trained on a target, the more likely it was to discharge, whether by intent or reflex. She was nearly on him when she realized the truth. He wasn't going to comply. She didn't hesitate. Her left hand shot forward, slamming down on Mercer's forearm with a forceful, downward strike, her palm angled to redirect the muzzle away from the woman's chest. The Glock jolted sideways, his grip loosening just enough for her right hand to catch the slide and rip it free from his grasp. It clattered to the pavement with a metallic ring, the sound louder than the murmurs and the shuffle of feet around them. Mercer staggered back, his arms flailing for balance, shock flashing across his face for the first time. He recovered quickly, reaching for the fallen weapon, but Morales was already stepping between him and the pistol, her stance wide, knees bent, hands up in a defensive block. "Don't," she said, her tone flat and dangerous. He reached anyway. With a swift, practiced motion, Morales caught his wrist, twisting it sharply behind his back. The move drew a sharp grunt from Mercer as she forced his weight forward, breaking his balance. "You're done!" she hissed into his ear, each word low and deliberate. He bucked against her hold, but she shifted her grip, locking his arm higher and planting her free hand against the back of his shoulder to drive him down another inch. She could feel his muscles straining, the heat of his frustration radiating off him, but she didn't let up. From the edge of the crowd, 2 uniformed cemetery patrol officers had started moving toward them, their strides quick but cautious. "Get over here and secure him," Morales barked without looking up, her eyes still on Mercer's profile. The officers closed in, one taking Mercer's other arm, the second moving to kick the Glock further out of reach. It skidded across the pavement until it came to rest near the wheel of the black SUV that had brought the general to the gravesite. "You're making a mistake," Mercer spat, his voice sharp with indignation. "She didn't belong here. She wasn't acting right." Morales didn't answer. She didn't trust herself to, not in front of the dozens of mourners who were already filming, not with the 3-star general still standing there, hands slowly lowering from a surrender posture she never should have been forced into. Instead, she gave the smallest nod to the cemetery patrol officers. "Cuff him! Take him to the car." As they moved Mercer away, his protests faded into the background noise of the crowd. Murmurs, whispers, the faint mechanical whir of phone cameras zooming in. Morales turned toward the general then, her breathing finally heavier now that the immediate threat was gone. "Ma'am," she said, her tone shifting from the sharp authority of an intervention to something steadier, almost deferential. "Are you all right?" General Naomi Caldwell straightened slowly, her knees stiff from the crouch, her heels crunching softly on the asphalt as she rose to her full height. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked past Morales, her gaze following the officers dragging Mercer toward the patrol car. Only when the distance between them was nearly 30 yards did she turn her eyes back. "I'm fine," she said at last, though her voice was quieter than Morales expected. "But this day—" She trailed off, her glance shifting to the casket a few yards away, the flag still perfectly in place. Morales nodded once, her own throat tight. She didn't need the general to finish that sentence. Behind them, Anthony stepped forward, his expression torn between gratitude for Morales's speed and a simmering anger at how close the encounter had come to disaster. Denise Harper joined him, her hand resting on Naomi's forearm for a brief, grounding moment. The honor guard, still in perfect formation, remained at attention, though Naomi could see the flicker of controlled emotion in their eyes. The crowd was restless now, the energy fractured. Some were speaking in low, urgent voices to one another, others still holding their phones aloft to capture the aftermath. Naomi knew that in the space of those few minutes, the day had shifted irrevocably. This was no longer just Daniel's funeral. It was a scene that would travel far beyond the gates of Arlington. Morales bent to pick up the Glock, ejecting the magazine with a sharp movement before handing both pieces to one of the cemetery officers. "Make sure this goes straight into evidence," she said. "Yes, Lieutenant," the officer replied, tucking the weapon away. Naomi exhaled slowly, the first deep breath she'd taken since Mercer had drawn his gun. Around her, the mourners were still watching, their collective gaze heavy with a mix of respect, disbelief, and outrage. She adjusted the cuffs of her jacket. the medals on her chest catching a faint glint of light. Glint of light. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she said finally. Her voice was calm, but there was a depth in it. A weight Morales knew came from a place far beyond the immediate incident. Morales inclined her head. "I just did my job, ma'am." Naomi gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No, you stopped a tragedy." They stood there for a moment longer, the stillness between them broken only by the distant hum of a jet passing overhead. Then, with the precision of a soldier returning to duty, Naomi turned back toward the graveside. There was still a funeral to finish, but Morales, even as she stepped back toward the gate, knew that finishing the service was only the smallest part of what lay ahead. This day would not be remembered for its folded flag and final salute. It would be remembered for the moment a mother in uniform faced the barrel of a gun, and the woman who ran across sacred ground to knock it away. By the time the folded flag was finally placed in Naomi Caldwell's hands, the day was already fractured beyond repair. The service finished without music, without the rifle salute Daniel had earned, without the solemn rhythm that should have been his due. It ended instead in a kind of stunned, subdued silence, as if every mourner understood they had witnessed something that had shifted the air around them. Naomi barely heard the chaplain's closing words. Her focus was on Daniel's casket, on the polished wood beneath her fingertips as she whispered a goodbye only he could hear, before stepping away on legs that felt carved from stone. What she didn't know, couldn't yet know, was that in the hours since Mercer had drawn his weapon on her, the moment had already been carved into digital permanence. The first video hit social media less than 30 minutes after the confrontation ended. Filmed from the third row of mourners, it was shaky, unfiltered, and damning. Naomi in full dress uniform, hands raised, her medals flashing in the dull light. Mercer's arm rigid as the pistol's barrel pointed straight at her chest. The crowd's gasps, the shouts of, "That's General Caldwell!" and the sound of Lieutenant Morales's voice cutting through the chaos were all captured in tinny, distorted audio, but they were unmistakable. Within 2 hours, there were a dozen versions of the same scene, each from a slightly different angle. One showed Anthony stepping forward, his face taut with fury, before Mercer swung the gun toward him. Another caught Denise Harper's sharp hand signal holding the honor guard in place. Yet another showed Morales's final lunge, the pistol clattering to the asphalt. By the third hour, the clips had been edited together into a single gut-punch montage circulating under a single banner. Justice for General Caldwell. It began as a hashtag among veterans and military families, many of them adding their own commentary. If a 3-star general in full uniform isn't safe, who is? She served her country for 35 years. This is how we repay her? Not acting right? She was burying her son. Within 6 hours, the hashtag trended nationally. By nightfall, it had broken into international feeds. The outrage came fast and hot, but the first official word from the police department was as cold as it was calculated. At 8:17 p.m., they posted a brief, sterile statement to their official account. "We are aware of an incident that occurred today at Arlington National Cemetery involving one of our officers. The officer has been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation." No mention of Naomi's rank. No acknowledgement that she was the grieving mother of a fallen soldier. No admission that a firearm had been drawn in the middle of a funeral. Just an incident. The comments section beneath the post exploded almost instantly. Thousands of replies flooded in from veterans, active duty service members, military spouses, and civilians alike. An incident? That was an armed threat against a general. Say her name, General Naomi Caldwell. Administrative leave isn't accountability. The post was ratioed within minutes, the department's attempt at damage control only fanning the flames. By then, Naomi was nowhere near the screens carrying her image into millions of homes. She had left Arlington as soon as the final words were spoken, allowing Anthony to shepherd her quietly to his car. Denise followed in her own vehicle, running silent interference with the straggle of reporters who had already begun gathering at the gates. Anthony's home was only a 20-minute drive from the cemetery, but it felt much longer. Naomi sat in the passenger seat, her hands resting in her lap, still wearing her gloves. She stared out the window, not seeing the slow blur of traffic or the red tail lights stretching ahead. Her mind was fixed in two places at once, on the memory of Daniel as a boy, running across the yard with his hair sticking up in the summer wind, and on the cold reality of the Glock's muzzle only feet from her chest. The two images collided until she could barely tell which one hurt more. Inside Anthony's house, Denise was already in the kitchen, making tea she knew Naomi wouldn't drink. Anthony helped his sister out of her jacket, carefully, as though she were made of glass. She didn't resist, but she didn't help either. The metals still gleamed on the deep blue fabric as he laid it across the back of a chair. For the first hour, no one spoke. Naomi sat on the couch, still in her uniform trousers and heels, staring at the blank television. Anthony paced. Denise busied herself with small, pointless tasks. Every so often, the vibration of a phone would break the quiet. Another message or missed call lighting up their screens. Old friends, fellow officers, journalists. None of them were answered. It wasn't until Denise's phone lit with a familiar number that Naomi stirred. It was from a retired general they'd both served with, a man who had mentored Naomi early in her career. Denise hesitated before answering, stepping into the hallway. Naomi could hear his voice even from the couch, low, controlled, but edged with something dangerous. "They're already showing it on every network," he said. "Naomi, it's everywhere." She didn't answer him directly. "It should never have happened," she murmured instead, her voice barely above a whisper. Anthony stopped pacing long enough to kneel in front of her, his hands resting on his knees. "You know this isn't going away, right?" he said. "Not after what they saw, not after how they treated you." Naomi's gaze flicked toward him, and for the first time since they'd left the cemetery, her eyes held something sharper than grief. "They didn't just treat me that way," she said slowly. "They treated my uniform that way. They treated every soldier I've ever commanded that way. And they treated my son's funeral like it was nothing." Anthony's jaw tightened. Denise reappeared in the doorway, her phone still in hand. "They're already calling for your statement," she said. "Every outlet you can think of. But I told them you're not speaking tonight." Naomi shook her head faintly. "There's nothing I could say tonight that wouldn't be drowned out by what happened today." By midnight, the footage had been replayed on every major network, framed by commentators alternating between disbelief and outrage. Veterans groups issued statements of support. Military brass, usually slow to weigh in on public controversy, began releasing carefully worded condemnations. The Department of Defense made no public comment, but Naomi's phone lit with a text from the secretary himself. "I saw. I'm here if you need me." She didn't answer. In the quiet of Anthony's living room, Naomi finally stood, crossing to the window. Outside, the street was dark, save for the occasional wash of headlights from passing cars. The normalcy of it was almost surreal. She had survived war zones. She had led missions under fire. She had carried the folded flags of soldiers who didn't make it home. But the only time she had ever felt a gun pointed at her on American soil was today, at her own son's funeral. She rested one hand against the cool glass, her reflection faint in the pain. In it, she saw not just herself, but every uniform she had ever worn, every soldier who had ever stood beside her, every family who had ever wept into a folded flag. The dignity stolen today was not hers alone. It was theirs, too. Behind her, Anthony muted the television, though the glow from the screen still lit the room. Denise sank into a chair, her posture finally softening in exhaustion. Naomi didn't turn around. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady now. "It's about the fact that my rank, my medals, my service, none of it mattered when he looked at me. All he saw was a threat." Anthony nodded silently. Outside, the night pressed in, carrying with it the weight of what tomorrow would bring. The fight for Daniel's dignity, and for her own, had only just begun. 6 months after that gray morning at Arlington, the courthouse steps were crowded before the sun had fully cleared the skyline. The air was sharp with winter cold, the kind that bit at fingertips and sent plumes of breath rising with every word. Reporters jostled for position along the barricades, cameras mounted on their shoulders, microphones bristling in the narrow aisle leading to the front doors. Veterans in full-dress uniforms filled the steps, their rows of medals glinting under the pale light. Some had traveled across the country to stand here, not just for Naomi Caldwell, but for what her case had come to mean. The federal indictment had moved quickly by legal standards. A Department of Justice investigation had found not just cause, but a pattern. 9 prior complaints against Officer Ryan Mercer for excessive force, many of them involving black men and women in uniform. One case was an almost perfect match. A black Army Reserve captain, stopped while in dress uniform, held at gunpoint for acting suspicious. That case had been quietly dismissed by local prosecutors at the time, the captain's formal complaint buried under a bureaucratic shrug. But now, in the harsh light of a national scandal, those records came back to life like a grim echo. Naomi arrived through a side entrance, escorted by federal marshals, Anthony on one side and Denise Harper on the other. She wasn't in uniform today. She had chosen a simple, dark suit with no ribbons, no insignia, just Naomi, the woman and the mother, not the general. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Rows of active-duty service members in dress blues filled the benches behind the prosecution table. Veterans in leather jackets and unit patches sat shoulder to shoulder with civilians who had never served but had been drawn here by the sheer injustice of what they'd seen on their screens months earlier. Mercer entered from the opposite side, wearing a plain gray suit, no badge, no tie. His eyes flicked once toward the gallery, then quickly away. If the rows of uniforms unsettled him, he didn't show it. His attorney moved with the kind of confidence that suggested a strategy already rehearsed. Mercer had acted in the line of duty, responding to what he perceived as a potential threat. But perception was about to be put on trial as much as Mercer was. The prosecution opened with the videos, each one displayed on a large screen, each angle replayed, each moment slowed, until the tension in the courtroom was so thick it felt like another person in the room. There was Naomi, her hands raised, the casket just feet away. Mercer's pistol leveled at her chest. Anthony stepping forward, the weapon swinging toward him. Lieutenant Morales's final sprint, the sharp knock of the gun hitting asphalt. When the lights came back on, no one moved for a moment. The jury's faces were still, but their eyes, wide, unblinking, spoke volumes. First to testify was Morales. Her posture was crisp, her voice steady, as she recounted the moment she realized what was happening from her post at the gate. "I saw a uniform I recognized instantly," she said. 3 silver stars. I didn't need a name to know she was high-ranking, and I saw a weapon drawn on her in the middle of a funeral. My priority was to stop a tragedy." The defense attorney tried to push her on procedure. "So you used physical force on a fellow officer?" "I stopped him from shooting an unarmed grieving mother," Morales replied without blinking. "Call it whatever you want." Colonel Denise Harper was next. She described the tension in the honor guard, the split-second decision to hold them back. "We were on the edge," she admitted. One wrong move, and it could have become something much worse. My job in that moment was to prevent bloodshed. But make no mistake, we all knew exactly who she was. Everyone except him. Anthony's testimony was brief, but unflinching. "I've known my sister all my life," he said, his gaze never leaving Mercer. "I've seen her lead men and women through things most of you couldn't imagine. And I've never felt more helpless than when I saw that gun pointed at her and knew I couldn't stop it." The prosecution then walked the jury through Mercer's disciplinary record, incident after incident, some dating back nearly a decade. They called witnesses from those prior cases, including the Army Reserve captain who had been held at gunpoint in uniform. His story mirrored Naomi's so closely that a low murmur swept through the gallery before the judge called for order. When it was Naomi's turn, she walked to the witness stand with the same deliberate pace she'd used to approach Daniel's casket that day. Her oath was quiet, but firm. "I didn't come here for revenge," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I came here for accountability." She paused, letting the words settle. "I have served this country for 35 years. I have stood in war zones. I have buried soldiers under my command, and I have faced down enemies who saw me as a target. But the only time I have ever had a gun pointed at me on American soil was at my own son's funeral. By one of our own." The courtroom was silent except for the faint scratch of a pen from a reporter's bench. Naomi's eyes never left Mercer as she spoke. "No mother should have to kneel in fear while she is trying to bury her child," she continued. "No uniform, whether it carries 3 stars or none, should be treated as a costume by someone sworn to protect and serve. I am not here because I want him to suffer. I am here because I want to make sure this doesn't happen to another mother, another soldier, another citizen. Ever." For the first time since the trial began, Mercer's eyes dropped to the table. The defense attempted to revive the perceived threat argument, suggesting Naomi's movements or demeanor could have been misinterpreted. But the videos, the witness accounts, and the context of her son's funeral dismantled that narrative piece by piece. The prosecutor's closing words landed like a gavel. This was not perception. This was prejudice. And it nearly ended in a tragedy we cannot measure. The jury deliberated for just over 4 hours. When they returned, the foreperson's voice was steady. Guilty on all counts. The judge wasted no time. "Ryan Mercer, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A stillness settled over the courtroom, heavy and sharp. In the gallery, some veterans bowed their heads. Others sat straighter, as if the verdict was a salute in itself. Naomi remained still, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. Outside, the courthouse steps were a crush of cameras and microphones, the cold air filled with shouted questions. Naomi emerged flanked by Anthony and Denise, the winter light catching in her hair. She paused at the top of the steps, scanning the crowd before speaking. "I didn't come here for revenge," she said again, her voice cutting clean through the noise. "I came for accountability. And I will ask you all the same question I've been asking myself since that day. If a 3-star general in full uniform can be seen as a threat while burying her own son, what does that mean for every other citizen without rank or medals to protect them?" She didn't wait for an answer. She stepped down into the waiting press, the words hanging in the cold air like a challenge that could not be ignored. The verdict was still ringing in the air when the courtroom emptied into the cold afternoon. Life without parole. The words had landed with the weight of finality, not just for Ryan Mercer, but for everyone who had followed this case from that gray morning at Arlington to this packed federal courtroom. Naomi Caldwell remained seated for a moment longer than the rest, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls. The sentence did not bring her joy. Nothing could. But it carried a stillness she hadn't felt since the day Daniel's body came home. When she finally rose, the crowd parted for her without a word, the shuffle of shoes on marble the only sound. Outside, the courthouse steps were a crush of flashing cameras, extended microphones, and reporters calling her name from every angle. Veterans in dress blues stood shoulder to shoulder at the edges, forming a quiet perimeter of respect. Anthony was at her right, Denise Harper at her left, both flanking her like the guards they had always been. The winter light was sharp, catching in her hair, glinting off the dark wool of her coat. She paused at the top of the steps, looking out at the sea of faces, some eager, some solemn, all waiting. When she spoke, her voice was steady, carrying over the hum of the crowd without the need for amplification. "I didn't come here for revenge," she began, echoing the words she had spoken on the witness stand. "I came for accountability." She let that settle for a moment, her eyes scanning the rows of cameras. "And I will leave you with this question. If a 3-star general in full uniform, with 35 years of service and a chest of medals, can be seen as a threat while burying her own son, what protects those without rank or ribbons to shield them?" The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward. The murmurs of the press quieted for a heartbeat before the questions began to fire again. But Naomi was already turning away. She descended the steps slowly, Anthony and Denise close behind, her heels clicking against the stone in a rhythm that seemed to echo long after she reached the waiting car. She didn't look back. By that evening, her words had been replayed on every major network. They led the nightly news, spliced with footage from the trial, from the cemetery, from the moment Morales had knocked the pistol from Mercer's hand. Justice. For General Caldwell shifted into a new wave of conversation, with headlines asking hard, public questions about bias, authority, and the fragility of safety for those who looked like her. Lawmakers referenced her statement in press conferences. Military leaders discussed it in briefings. Civil rights groups used it as a rallying cry. Naomi had not planned a movement, but her truth had lit one. She did not watch the coverage. The morning after the verdict, before the sun had fully risen, Naomi left Anthony's house without waking him or Denise. She drove herself through the quiet streets, the frost still clinging to the edges of lawns, the world muted in the pale light of early day. Her destination was already decided. The gates of Arlington National Cemetery were still closed to the public when she arrived, but she was waved through by the guards without question. She parked near Section 60 and walked the rest of the way, her breath visible in the cold. The ground was firm beneath her heels, the rows of white headstones stretching into the distance like a silent formation. She carried only one thing in her hand, a single sunflower. Daniel had always loved them. As a boy, he had planted a row of them along the fence in their backyard, stubbornly tending to them every day one summer despite the heat. She remembered him running into the house, face bright, to tell her the first one had bloomed. He'd said they looked like they were smiling. She found his grave easily. It was etched into her memory as much as it was into the stone. The grass around it was neatly trimmed, the headstone clean and white, the engraving sharp. She crouched down, resting the sunflower against the base, her gloved fingers lingering for a moment on the stem. The cemetery was empty save for her. No cameras, no onlookers, no questions. Just the quiet hum of wind through the bare branches and the distant sound of footsteps from the groundskeepers beginning their work. "I kept my promise," she said softly, her breath clouding in the air. "I stood for you." Her hand moved to the top of the stone, her fingers brushing over his name. She closed her eyes and let the silence settle around her. It wasn't peace, not entirely, but it was something close. Naomi stayed there for a long time, seated in a folding chair she'd brought from the trunk of her car. She listened to the wind, to the muted hum of the city far beyond the gates, to the small, natural sounds that had nothing to do with courtrooms or headlines. She thought about the people who had stood with her, Anthony, Denise, Morales, and about the strangers who had written to her, veterans and civilians alike, saying they were sorry the uniform hadn't been enough to protect her. Eventually, the light shifted, stretching long shadows across the grass. Naomi rose, folding the chair and tucking it under her arm. She looked down at the sunflower one last time, the bright yellow standing in sharp contrast against the cold white stone. "Rest easy, son," she murmured. "I'll take it from here." She turned and began the walk back to her car, her footsteps slow but steady. Behind her, the sunflower leaned gently against the headstone, its face turned toward the pale winter sun. That day, there were no speeches, no interviews, no noise, just a mother and her son, and the quiet knowledge that some battles are fought in public, and others are fought alone, both carrying the same weight. What happened to General Naomi Caldwell is not just the story of one mother or one funeral. It is a mirror held up to America. It forces us to ask what kind of country we are if 35 years of service, 3 silver stars, and a lifetime of sacrifice cannot protect a grieving mother from being seen as a threat. It forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. If this can happen in the most sacred ground we have, in full view of veterans, active duty soldiers, and children, then it can happen anywhere, to anyone. The videos from that morning traveled across the nation in less than 6 hours, but the problem they revealed has been here for generations. Accountability is not about one verdict or one sentence. It's about building a culture where authority serves the people, not itself, and where dignity is not conditional on skin color, rank, or uniform. Naomi's calm, steady words, "No mother should have to kneel in fear while burying her child," should echo far beyond the walls of any courtroom. They are not just her truth. They are a call to all of us. If you wear a uniform, her story is a reminder that the oath to protect is sacred. If you don't, it's a reminder that you have a role to play in demanding that oath be honored. As citizens, we cannot afford to treat injustice as an incident to scroll past. We have the power to amplify truth, to stand beside those who are silenced, and to hold systems accountable when they fail. We have the choice, every day, between turning away and speaking up. Naomi stood for her son that morning. Morales ran toward danger to stop a tragedy. Veterans and mourners refused to let the moment disappear without witness. Now it's our turn. Share her story so it cannot be buried. Talk about it at your dinner table, in your classrooms, in your communities. Demand better training, real oversight, and a justice system that values every life equally. And if this story moved you, if it made you stop and think about the country we are shaping, then be part of keeping that conversation alive. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that matter, hit the like button to help this reach more people, and share this video so the lesson of that day travels farther than the harm ever could. Change begins when enough of us refuse to look away. Let's make sure this is not just another headline, but a turning point.